U-turn Chapter 1 Municipalities warnings: do not kill yourself outside the designated areas. Even though notices were posted on every street, corpses piled up everywhere. The number of dead was so overwhelming that it became impossible to clear them all. The stench of bodies stacked in garbage bins filled the entire country. Actually, it all began 3 years ago. Back then, it was already being said that material resources were on the verge of depletion, and a famine was anticipated. Economists and ministries were developing various programs, searching for ways to escape the crisis. However, a solution to the problem seemed impossible. The government's strength wasn't enough to stop the looming famine from eventually knocking on the door. All they could do was delay it for a while. It wasn't long before resources rapidly dwindled, and a severe shortage began across the country. People flooded the streets, protested, and demanded an urgent solution to the crisis. However, people fully understood that there was no way out of the situation and had already accepted the government's helplessness. Yet, despite everything, everyone still held on to the hope that a miracle might happen. During the heated debates, a terrifying idea was broadcast on television. One of the prominent economists proposed an extremely cruel solution to prevent the famine. He explained that the average life expectancy in the country was 70, and that resources had been calculated based on this. By eliminating everyone over that age, they could temporarily stave off the famine. This idea spread among the population in the blink of an eye. Soon it was the only topic of discussion everywhere. Though no one wanted to admit it, everyone knew there was no other solution, and they felt forced to agree with the idea. At that moment, the government announced its support for the program. People couldn't comprehend such a thing happening. Even imagining it in their minds filled them with horror. Various forms of protests were held, and humanitarian organizations issued statements urging the country's leadership to reconsider. It was all in vain. The government officially reaffirmed its support for the program. Soon after, social campaign videos promoting the project began to appear on television screens. In the campaign videos, volunteers over the age of 70 declared their willingness to say yes to the campaign, stating that they would sacrifice themselves for the future of the country and for others to live more comfortably. The media began discussing the government's decision, gathering opinions from various people. Despite widespread discontent, the program was passed in Parliament. First, a registry of everyone over 70 was created. Then, special locations were designated for their death and burial. Amid tears and protests, the elderly were killed and buried as part of the process. On that day, the country declared a day of mourning. Government officials appeared on television, trying to convince people that this was the right path, calling those who had died heroes. The public, filled with despair and a waning will to live, nonetheless believed that the danger had passed. However, it soon became clear that even these deaths could not solve the problem. After a brief period of relief, the country once again faced the threat of famine. What had happened made people reconsider. New solutions were sought. The government introduced a new program. The average life expectancy was lowered from 70 to 65. According to the new decision, everyone over 65 would have to be killed. This time, people did not protest as fiercely as before. The number of programs related to this issue on television had decreased. The decision was carried out with ease. People could only muster the strength to shed tears. A year later, the situation in the country worsened again. The government began searching for new solutions. Everyone was waiting to see what decision would be made and what steps the government would take. Those over 60 were particularly anxious. The drastic drop in the age of death terrified people. However, this time the government made a different decision. According to the new rules, the average life expectancy was not lowered. Instead, a lottery would determine who would die. The country was thrown into turmoil once again. The public felt the fear of death more acutely, driving them back into the streets. But protests were quickly suppressed. The government set a date for the first lottery to be held. Many applauded this decision, claiming it was a great honor to sacrifice themselves for the future of society. Thus, the first selection took place, and the victims were determined. The lottery, which had always been a means of positively changing people's lives, had now become a literal instrument of altering human fate. Until the day the first victims were executed in designated locations, everything that had transpired felt like a bad dream to everyone. Deep down, everyone was convinced that their names would not be drawn from the lottery. It was as if those whose names were selected lived in some other country. Chaos reigned in the nation, with mass suicides occurring everywhere. Some took up arms and flooded the streets, killing anyone in their path to reduce the number of people in the next lottery. Although television broadcasts warned, "Do not die outside of designated areas," people were killing themselves wherever they pleased. The streets were filled with corpses. The garbage trucks operated in a 3-shift system to collect the bodies. Whenever someone's name was drawn in the lottery, their entire family would desperately search for a way to save that person. Sometimes entire families committed suicide, or the head of the household would sacrifice themselves in place of their children. Famous figures appeared on television, declaring that they were sacrificing themselves for the people. After their deaths, monuments were erected in their honor and their names were immortalized. He woke up from a deep sleep, feeling strange. It was as if everything happening in the country had nothing to do with him. A profound emptiness had engulfed him. Suddenly the thought of suicide crossed his mind. He moved to the next room and pulled out his old revolver from the chest. Sitting on a chair, he rested his elbows on the table in front of him. As he unwrapped the cloth that covered the revolver, he began to clean the weapon with it. He played with the gun in his hands, contemplating how he would end his life. He put the barrel in his mouth. The taste of the metal made him feel nauseous. He removed the barrel from his mouth and pressed it against his temple. He had made up his mind he would count to 3 and then pull the trigger. He took out the lighter and placed his hand on the trigger. 1, 2. Just as he was about to say 3, there was a loud knock on the door. He jumped, nearly pulling the trigger. True, he wanted to die anyway, but not like this, unprepared and without saying 3. The door was knocked again. He slid the bolt back and placed the gun inside. When he opened the door, he found 2 agents in yellow vests from the security forces standing before him. They handed him a letter and said, "We'll be back." In a state of confusion, he tried to comprehend what was happening. He opened the letter in his hand and read it. His name was on the list from the lottery held yesterday. The letter stated that he would be killed in 3 days, detailing the procedures to follow. At the end of the letter, there was a special note: "Please do not attempt suicide. Your death must be carried out by the state. This is necessary for future generations." He had been unaware of the lottery held yesterday and was struggling to understand what was happening. He returned to the table. He picked up the gun and placed it on the table. On one side lay the letter about his death, then on the other side was the weapon he had intended to use to take his own life. Everything was slowly starting to become clear. It felt as if he was just beginning to grasp what death really meant. He had been playing a game all along. He hadn't realized how heavy the feeling of death could be. He fixed his gaze on a point, standing still and motionless. He wanted to forget the paper and the gun on the table, yet afraid of catching sight of them, he kept his eyes locked on one spot for a long time. But there was no use. He could no longer deceive himself. He had to accept the truth lying on the table. He quickly slid the drawer open and placed the gun and the letter inside. Taking a deep breath, it felt as if everything were a dream, and as long as the letter remained in the drawer, this dream wouldn't come true. He lay down on his bed, unaware of when he fell asleep. He awoke to the sound of the doorbell early the next morning. Everything had slipped from his mind. When he opened the door and saw a man in a white coat, he was taken aback. The man in the white coat introduced himself as a psychologist sent by the government. The psychologist entered and provided a detailed explanation. "The state assigns a special doctor to everyone whose name is drawn in the lottery. We are here to prevent you from committing suicide and to provide psychological support." He spoke about how death wasn't as frightening as it seemed and how the government created every condition for death. But he wasn't really listening to the psychologist. Slowly he began to recall the events of the previous day and realized that he was just a day away from death. He still hoped it was all a game or a joke, waiting for a miracle to happen. The psychologist talked a bit more before saying he had to go, assuring him that he could reach out if he needed any help. He advised him to stay strong and tried to reassure him that there was nothing to fear. After the doctor left, he felt like he had fallen into a vast emptiness. True, he hadn't retained much of what the psychologist had said, but his departure amplified his sense of loneliness. He He didn't know what to do. He went over and opened the drawer again. He pressed the gun to his temple. Just as he was about to pull the trigger, his eyes landed on the letter. He squeezed his eyes shut and gripped the gun tightly. The piece of paper wouldn't leave his mind. Frustrated that he couldn't bring himself to end his life, he threw the gun into the corner of the room. Then he knelt down and began to cry. He had hundreds, thousands of scenarios running through his mind. Maybe he should go outside and kill whoever crossed his path. But soon he realized how difficult that would be. He was not that brave. None of the scenarios or plans were of any use. Minutes were leading him to death. Time sometimes stood still, sometimes rushed by. He couldn't control it. He took the clock off the wall, broke the mirror, and held the hands in his hand. After a while of standing like this, he broke the hands and squeezed them in his palm. Even without a clock, he could feel time rushing by. Until morning, he wandered all over his house, in every corner, as if he were saying goodbye to a close one. In the early morning, there was a knock on the door. He didn't open it. It wasn't out of self-preservation. He simply couldn't find the strength to open the door. After all, he was going to die. Let them open the door themselves. He was no longer obliged to obey any rules. After knocking on the door for quite some time and seeing that there was no response from inside, they began to open it with special tools. They were accustomed to such situations. They always carry iron tools to open doors with them. When the psychologist was the first to enter and saw him, he was horrified. He had aged overnight. "This is not how we talked," he said. The people in yellow vests grabbed him by the arms and took him to a vehicle. They brought him to the place where those whose names were drawn in the lottery were kept. When he got out of the car and looked around, everything was bright and surrounded by greenery. Seeing the white and green colors, he couldn't believe he would die here. When he walked through the door, he looked back. He realized that everything was coming to an end. He had lost all his senses. It felt as if he were in the air in a void. The psychologist first conducted individual conversations, then group therapy began. There were 10 people sentenced to death here. When he saw the old man, he felt a pang of envy. He thought that for someone who had lived a significant part of his life, death wouldn't be so frightening. Afterward, they were taken to the cafeteria. The table was laid out with all kinds of delicacies. Some thought about how they would only take something with them from this world, greedily shoving whatever they could into their hands, while others stared blankly at the food in front of them. According to the rules, they inquired if anyone wanted to write a letter to their loved ones or if there was anything they wanted to do before they died. He wrote a letter to his only relative, his home, even if it was to no one else. Then they asked him how he wanted to die. He chose to die in the electric chair. For some reason, he felt that the electric current would dry out his entire body, and dying this way would be more comfortable for him. After this stage, people were grouped according to their methods of death. His group had the least number of people. Most wanted to hang themselves, drink poison, or cut their veins to die. Strangely enough, there were also those who wished to be crucified or jump from high buildings. They took him to the barber. They cut the middle of his hair. When he looked at himself in the mirror, he asked to have his hair shaved from the roots. He was sitting in the electric chair. His arms and legs were tightly bound. A wet sponge was placed on the top of his head. This was necessary for the current to spread quickly. His body twitched. They attached a current-conducting cap to his head. The red light above was replaced by yellow. The psychologist asked if he wanted to say anything. He remained silent. He still didn't believe he was going to die. Maybe he had already died. The light above changed from yellow to green. The yellow-jacketed assistant reached for the electric switch. By delaying the procedure for a few seconds, he was granting him a few extra moments of life, fulfilling his moral duty. Everyone was bewildered. The green light had been replaced by a red one. The guard didn't understand this. He quickly left the room and returned after a while. With a blank expression on his face, he congratulated him. "You have been saved from death. Someone is willing to die in your place." He thought he was already dead and that the events occurring before him looked like a dream in a tunnel leading to the afterlife. He felt nothing. They unbound his arms and legs. He threw himself to the ground, screaming and crying. He clung tightly to the guard's legs and kissed his shoes. The assistants lifted him up and took him to another room. After a while, he managed to calm down a little. He was curious about the identity of the person willing to die in his place. As far as he knew, there was no one else. At that moment, a middle-aged woman appeared at the door. She was looking at him quietly. He recognized the woman. They had lived together for a while. Then they separated because their life together had become boring. He felt pity for her. The woman began to speak slowly. I'm fed up with everything. I don't want to live. Last month, I lost my father in the lottery. There's no point in living alone. Yesterday, I put a stool down and hung a rope from the ceiling. I got on the stool and put the rope around my neck. Ever since my father died, I've been afraid to be alone in the house. That's why I always leave the television on. And no, it sounds ridiculous. A person is afraid of unseen forces even when they want to end their own life. When the rope was around my neck, they were announcing the lottery results. Suddenly I heard your name. I thought I was going to die anyway. At least I could save you. His entire body was numb. He couldn't say anything. The woman smiled faintly. When I heard your name on the television, I got excited and my foot slipped. The stool almost tipped over. I barely managed to hold on. Can you imagine if the stool had tipped? I wouldn't have been able to save you.